Welcome to the Explainer. Look, if you want to truly understand modern global security, the energy markets that are currently dictating your gas prices, or just the overall balance of power in the Middle East, there is one geopolitical rivalry you simply have to wrap your head around, and that's the relationship between the United States and Iran. For more than 70 years, this relationship has been one of the most volatile, unpredictable forces in international politics. But what makes this so fascinating, and honestly so incredibly tragic, is that this wasn't always a rivalry. No. It actually began as a strategic partnership back during the Cold War. Today, we're going to look at exactly how that partnership mutated into a 70-year geopolitical crisis. And to do this fairly, we'll be exploring the American interpretation of history right alongside the Iranian counternarrative.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To actually make sense of the modern crisis, the sanctions, the proxy conflicts, the nuclear disputes we hear about every day, we have to look at the foundational history. But here's the thing. History isn't just a dry list of facts. It's all about how those facts are interpreted. The conflict between Washington and Tehran is driven by two profoundly different historical realities. Neither side views the past the same way, which means they fundamentally misunderstand each other's motives in the present.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit 1. Two histories, one conflict. 2. Deepen distrust and war. 3. The nuclear flashpoint. 4. Deals broken and escalation. 5. Opposing strategic goals today. And finally, 6. Why the conflict persists.
All right, let's get into Section 1, Two Histories, One Conflict, the foundational traumas of 1953 and 1979. To trace the origins of all this mutual suspicion, we really have to go back to the early days of the Cold War.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how the exact same event can be remembered so entirely differently. Take 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh, who, fun fact, was actually Time magazine's Man of the Year, had just nationalized Iran's oil industry. In response, the US and Britain supported a coup that completely removed him from power. Now, through the American interpretation of history, this was viewed as a totally necessary anti-Soviet containment move. Washington argued that Mossadegh's policies were destabilizing Iran, potentially opening the back door to Soviet expansion, so they backed the Shah, who became this crucial American ally. But contrast that with the Iranian counternarrative. For many Iranians, 1953 is literally the original sin of US-Iran relations. They view it as the blatant overthrow of a democratically elected leader done for no other reason than to protect Western oil interests.
And that simmering resentment? Well, it absolutely boiled over in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and Iranian students subsequently seized the US Embassy in Tehran. For the United States, that 444-day hostage crisis represents profound national humiliation. It instantly flipped Iran from a close ally to a deeply hostile regime, and it became the ultimate symbol of anti-American extremism. But flip the coin to the Iranian counternarrative. For them, that embassy was essentially viewed as a den of spies. Supporters of the revolution genuinely, truly feared Washington was plotting another 1953-style coup. To them, taking the embassy wasn't terrorism, it was a vital act of resistance against decades of foreign domination.
Moving into Section 2. Deepening distrust and war. The 1980s and the Iran-Iraq War. This is where those early political grievances really calcified into bloody conflict.
So, in 1980, Iraq invades Iran, kicking off this absolutely brutal war that dragged on until 1988. Now, the objective historical facts are these. The invasion happened, the United States generally tilted its support toward Iraq during the conflict, and the war ended with an estimated 500,000 to 1 million casualties, just leaving behind a totally devastated landscape. But again, it's the subjective takeaways from this era that defined the future.
And this brilliantly illustrates the divide. Washington watched the 80s unfold and basically saw a terrifying domino effect. They grew entirely convinced that revolutionary Iran was a permanent destabilizing force intent on spreading Islamic revolutionary ideology across the whole Middle East. Contrast that with the Iranian counternarrative. We're talking deep, lasting psychological scars formed by the horrors of that war, including the use of chemical weapons, and the unshakable belief that the US actively aided Saddam Hussein while their own country bled. This era essentially cemented a profound structural distrust of the West and Tehran.
Which brings us to Section 3, the nuclear flashpoint, the central dispute of the modern era. By the 1990s and 2000s, the entire battlefield shifts toward accusations of terrorism and, most critically, the pursuit of nuclear technology.
Right, here is the central dispute of the modern era laid out as clearly as possible. The American interpretation is that preventing a nuclear-armed Iran is absolutely 100% essential for both regional and global security. They argue that Iran's enrichment activities could eventually produce weapons. But right alongside that, we have the Iranian counternarrative. They insist emphatically that their program is strictly for peaceful purposes, like energy production and medicine. Furthermore, they fiercely argue that as a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they have a fundamental legal right to enrich uranium for civilian use.
Now for Section 4, Deals Broken and Escalation, the JCPOA and the return of maximum pressure. There was this brief, hopeful moment of diplomatic optimism, but its rapid collapse confirmed everybody's worst fears.
Let's see how this builds a modern timeline of escalation. In 2015, you have the historic JCPOA nuclear deal signed between Iran and major world powers. Huge deal. But just 3 years later, in 2018, the U.S. completely withdraws and reinstates incredibly harsh sanctions. And by 2020, tensions reach an absolute boiling point when the U.S. kills Iranian General Qasem Soleimani.
That 2018 withdrawal? Massive turning point. The American interpretation argued the 2015 deal was just inherently insufficient because it didn't address Iran's regional proxy activities. The thought process was that a maximum pressure campaign of sanctions would force a broader, better agreement. However, the Iranian counter-narrative viewed this as the ultimate betrayal. I mean, they had expected major sanctions relief in exchange for severe restrictions on their nuclear activities. For Tehran, the U.S. pulling out was hard, undeniable proof that Washington simply cannot be trusted to honor its international commitments. It effectively destroyed any remaining diplomatic trust.
And frankly, that broken trust directly fuels the crises we're seeing right now. In 2025 and 2026, this conflict entered a highly volatile new phase. According to multiple reports, we're seeing a really dangerous mix of U.S. and Israeli military operations targeting Iranian military and nuclear-related facilities. On the flip side, Iran has retaliated with massive missile and drone attacks, along with severe threats to maritime traffic in the critical Strait of Hormuz, which is a literal choke point for the entire global economy. And all of this chaos is happening amidst ongoing negotiations, proxy conflicts, and incredibly fragile regional ceasefires.
So, knowing all this history, where does that leave us? Section 5, Opposing Strategic Goals Today. What do both sides actually want right now?
Think about it. How do decades of mutual suspicion, broken treaties, and proxy wars actually translate onto the modern geopolitical chessboard? What are the core, absolute non-negotiable objectives for Washington and Tehran today?
When you map out their core objectives today, you see exactly why they inherently clash. Washington wants to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, protect U.S. forces and allies like Israel and Gulf Arab states, limit Iranian proxy influence, and maintain freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. Conversely, Tehran's prime directives are preserving regime survival, deterring foreign intervention, ending those crushing economic sanctions, and maintaining their own regional influence. You can literally see the collision course here. Washington's need to protect regional allies and limit proxies directly threatens Tehran's strategy of using those exact same proxies to maintain regional influence and deter intervention. Their core survival mechanisms are entirely, fundamentally at odds.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Why the Conflict Persists, the Cycle of Defensive Aggression. Let's summarize why this incredibly complex rivalry seems almost impossible to solve.
So, the crucial point is really this. Neither side believes they are the aggressor. The United States looks at Iran and sees a fundamental source of instability, a major threat to global energy and allied security that absolutely must be contained. Conversely, Iran looks out at the U.S. military presence completely surrounding them in the Middle East and sees a long-term external threat aiming to undermine their sovereignty. They both genuinely believe they are just defending themselves.
And because both sides feel they're strictly on the defensive, these unresolved issues just keep stacking up, blocking any real path to peace. We're dealing with the ongoing dispute over nuclear enrichment, the devastating real-world impact of economic sanctions, the activities of regional proxy groups, the paramount issue of Israel's security, the continued U.S. military footprint in the Middle East, and undergirding it all, the whole shebang, is a profound mutual distrust rooted in decades of unhealed historical grievances. Understanding this specific list is absolutely vital if you want to make sense of everyday news headlines.
Which leaves us with one massive lingering question. You see, the U.S.-Iran conflict isn't just about uranium or oil. It is about competing narratives and perceived historical injustices. So can two nations with fundamentally opposed historical realities ever actually find a lasting peace? Or is this cycle of defensive aggression just the permanent new normal for the Middle East? Remember, understanding both of these perspectives doesn't mean you have to agree with either of them, but grasping both the American interpretation and the Iranian counter-narrative is absolutely mandatory if you want to understand one of the most important geopolitical conflicts of the modern era. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the headlines.